Here's a fun fact for you. Wednesdays are statistically the most underrated day of the week. But guess what? That's also when Damn Parenting Podcast drops. So subscribe, follow, and never miss it. Because if Wednesdays have to exist, we might as well make it a little bit more supportive and a little more like your village is showing up for you and your family. All right, let's get into this week's episode and see how we can navigate parenting together, one step at a time. Welcome back to Damn Parenting, the podcast where chaos is basically the main character. You know, tantrums and diaper blowouts and the occasional cold coffee, they just cameo. I'm your host Eva, and today we're diving into a topic that has been requested by several listeners, going from one child to two. And we are delighted to tackle it through the lens of supporting your firstborn, because let's be honest, while the newborn gets a lot of the attention, your eldest deserves to feel loved, included, and confident as the family grows. This episode is all about sibling dynamics, routines getting flipped upside down, and helping your first child navigate the emotional roller coaster of welcoming a new sibling. We'll talk jealousy, practical strategies, and ways to make sure your firstborn still feels like the VIP of your family universe. Of course, you can't prepare for everything. You know, kids will always surprise us, probably in public as well. Probably while you're actually holding the baby and wondering if you are ever going to get to pee again. But what you can do is show up with insight, strategies, and a little foresight, which is exactly why we've got the fabulous Faye from Kerr Psychology, our resident child psychologist, back on here to share expert advice, practical tips, and some real-life wisdom. So whether you're gearing up for round two, already in the thick of it, or just curious about how to help your firstborn feel secure, included, and still fabulous, stay tuned. We've got laughs and lessons and a reality check, well, one or two of them, that every parent secretly needs. So let's dive in. Welcome back, Faye.
Hello, it's so nice to be back with you today.
So let's start with how parents can actually help their firstborn get ready for a new sibling. There's so much to talk about here, and especially before the baby even arrives. So first question, how do you begin the conversation with your first child about a new baby? How do you make it age appropriate? Because it can happen at any stage, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, I think there's a couple of things to consider. One of the most important factors is making sure you really prepare your child as early as possible, as early as you feel comfortable in sharing that news with your child. So just making sure that you include them, making sure you have an initial discussion about there's a new baby coming or however you might want to introduce that, but also continue to have those discussions. Now, the way that you talk to your child will very much depend on their chronological age, but also their level of understanding and their current level of development right now. Depending on the age, it will differ in terms of what you say. But I guess the key point will be sharing with them that there's a new baby on the way and sharing some of the lovely things that will come out of that. But also at the same time, sharing some of the realities of that as well along the way to fully prepare them. So you could talk about things like the advantages. So they're going to have someone to play with when they're older. You're going to be able to teach them new skills. You're going to be able to chat along to them and maybe teach them a couple of new words, all those types of things. I suppose the point is really including your older child and talking about how they can become involved and how there can be advantages around having that younger sibling. But also at the same time, as we know, transitioning from one child to two is a huge upheaval. It's a huge change. And it's not just a huge adjustment for us, it's also a huge adjustment for our older child as well. They're used to being the only child in the family, and suddenly this new tiny baby who is completely reliant on its parents comes into the world, and it naturally does change the dynamics. It naturally changes kind of what's happening in the family and the routine. So preparing your child for that as much as possible is important, but obviously taking into account their age and their level of understanding. I suppose in terms of thinking about some of the downsides, I suppose being honest about this baby is going to need some of my attention. You're at the moment, I suppose for my little boy, I'm thinking about my little boy's 3.5, and he is increasingly becoming more independent. And, you know, he can put his own clothes on. He now goes to the toilet by himself. He can obviously feed himself. He likes to do some independent play at times. And I suppose having a conversation with them about, well, when this baby arrives, they're going to need my help a lot because they're not able to be independent like you. that they'll definitely need help around feeding, they'll need their nappies changing, they will need help to support them to go to sleep, they will need lots of cuddles and time, and just being realistic about that, but also being realistic about this baby is going to cry is another one, and just kind of managing their expectations rather than just completely giving them a really positive picture just helps them to kind of understand, oh, actually, this is going to be a change, but also not being all doom and gloom at the same time, kind of like balancing the two to support them in understanding that things are going to be different, but also at the same time, you want to continue to do things that make them feel special and make them feel included and part of the family.
I'm a massive fan of books for introductions. What can you say about books for this specific topic?
I would completely agree with you with books. I think books are amazing for telling stories. They're amazing for opening up discussions, because sometimes it can be really difficult to just have a one-to-one kind of face-to-face conversation about a certain topic. And sometimes books can be that bridge for us to support us in having those discussions. And often when you are reading a book about somebody different, you can then start to relate that to your own experience, or you can have discussions around, oh, well, this happened for them. What do you think might happen for us? So yeah, they're a great discussion tool to really open up kind of what might happen, or again, to manage those expectations. I haven't personally read any of these books, but other people have recommended them. So I Am a Big Brother or a Big Sister is one that's also been recommended. And also I've spoken to people who've really recommended personalised books by Wonderbly. They do personalised books with all the child's name on it. And it's around preparing to be a big brother or preparing to be a big sister. But the personalised element is also quite nice in supporting them, I suppose, to think about certain things.
I love that. I actually hadn't thought about that side. I will create a little slide here in the Instagram reel so you'll be able to go, and I'll also have a list of appropriate books that might actually work for you as well. But on the other hand, parents often wonder if, when is a good time to have a baby, and if now is a good time to, move the baby's room, or that they should start daycare, or there should be a change in routine. Why is it actually important to avoid big transitions around the time a baby arrives?
You are absolutely right that it is important to avoid big changes and big transitions if you possibly can during the time baby arrives, because the baby arriving is already a big change for everybody, for parents, for the child. And if we can try and keep certain things as consistent as possible, so for example, where you live, daycare, sleep routines, all those types of things, it helps to support the child in feeling more secure and more confident. And it just reduces those wider uncertainties, because a baby coming into the world, expanding a family from 3 to 4 is a big uncertainty, especially for a young person who, is a little bit unsure about how is this going to impact me? The more you can keep certain things consistent, the better, just to support them in feeling safe and secure, and in feeling that, certain things can stay the same. I know when I've done some reading around this, one of the recommendations that I have come across is establishing like a really, really nice routine beforehand. So it might be like a nice routine around spending kind of special time. So like 15 minutes a day playing with mum and with dad, or however your family dynamics might work, and establishing that routine before baby arrives, and then being very, very clear that that routine then continues once baby has arrived, just to make sure that they still have that time where they feel special, where they feel really part of the family, and that their needs really matter too.
So let's talk about something that affects nearly all families at one stage in their life when they have more than one child. Even before the baby arrives, sibling jealousy and rivalry can be a concern. How can parents prepare the first child for this emotional shift? I mean, it's really common. So, what can parents do before the baby is going to come to reduce that intensity and help our first child feel so secure?
I think this is a really tricky one. And something always sticks in my mind. It's something that I read when I was reading the Kate Silverton book, There's No Such Thing as Naughty. And she always talks about how, imagine if your other half brought a new girlfriend or boyfriend home, and they were like, oh, isn't she wonderful? Isn't she so beautiful? And everyone was just kind of talking about so positively and amazingly about how wonderful this person is. and we're completely ignoring you. Like, how would you feel? And then she kind of switches it to be like, well, imagine that that's possibly how an older child would feel about a new baby being brought into the family, in that they've been the center of that family. And suddenly there's a shift and there's a new baby that everyone is interested in. And that is tricky. It's a tricky dynamic for anyone to navigate, let alone a young child who's still very much developing their own self-identity, developing their own thought process and understanding where they fit in the world. So naturally, there is going to be an element of what about me, or an element of kind of, understanding how these dynamics are going to work. So I suppose in terms of thinking about how to support, I think it's just including them in as much as possible. So including them in discussions around, oh, what might we call the baby, even if you might not go with that name, but having those discussions. Or I know you in a discussion that we had before we started recording, maybe involving them in things like painting and decorating the nursery. I know that another thing that I've come across is maybe taking them to midwife appointments, or taking them to scans where they can see the baby on the scan monitor, and maybe just talking about kind of the baby and how they'll fit into the family dynamic. I think also answer any questions that they have. Now, the funny thing about this is that children come out with the funniest questions. And I suppose it's about answering those questions in a way that's been as honest as possible, but also at the same time is in an age appropriate way for them. So, for example, I know recently someone who is pregnant said to me that their oldest child said to them, so how's the baby going to come out? Yeah, and it made them laugh at the time in terms of, oh, how am I going to explain this to a 3-year-old? But actually, it's giving them that information in an age-appropriate way to support them in understanding what's going to happen or what to expect, because they are naturally going to have questions too. And it's okay to answer those questions in a way that's age-appropriate and in a way that you feel the most comfortable.
So once the baby arrives, you spoke about routines earlier. How are parents actually meant to keep the first child's schedule consistent enough to give them stability? You mentioned earlier about having a consistent block of time of 15 minutes here or there. But as we all know, if one parent's away and then one's left and it's bedtime and you have to put one kid to bed and they don't want the baby there, and how is it that you'll be able to avoid any conflict here with sibling rivalry or jealousy when it comes to this level?
I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because I think every child is different. Every child responds differently. And every family dynamic is different to some extent. And there's always situations that we can't control. And there's always certain things that we will try our best with. But I suppose it's trying to keep certain things as consistent as possible, or trying to support your child in understanding that they are still important within that family dynamic. Also, I think as much as you can, optimizing those moments of connection with your child, especially when the baby first arrives. It's likely that the older child is going to need more cuddles and more comfort from you, and because it is a period of uncertainty. So I'm going to use a phrase that my husband often uses, but over-index on comfort. But you can never provide too much comfort. And I think where possible, if you can provide as much comfort as you possibly can during that time, it will really help to settle them. And as I say, thinking about things like that special time and maintaining those routines, or maintaining that bedtime routine of reading a story before bed, and one of the parents kind of settling them down before that. So yeah, I think as much as you can, if you can establish those routines and kind of support them in feeling like they are an important part of the family. Tips that I have come across are things like, when visitors visit, ask them to pay attention to the older child first before paying attention to the baby, or before going to see the baby, because that in itself kind of, again, detracts away from, oh, look at the baby, it's so beautiful. Whereas the other child's like, hey, I'm still here. You usually pay loads of attention to me. So kind of switching that dynamic a little bit. And I have also heard suggestions where speaking to the baby when the toddler is around saying, oh, hang on a minute, baby, I just need to sort out the older child, or I just need to do this for the older child. So supporting the toddler to see that their needs are still important by asking the baby to wait, even though the baby obviously doesn't understand, but it's for the toddler's benefit. Or one of the other things you could do is target kind of certain behaviors that you want to see around the baby. So for example, you want the older sibling to be gentle, be kind, or maybe you involve them in certain things like, oh, can you go get me a diaper, or can you go get me the nappy cream, or please can you go get me a new baby grow. But involving them in things again helps them to feel needed, helps them to feel wanted in that situation. And children love to help. Children absolutely love to help. So again, it helps to support that dynamic. But what I was also going to say was that it can be really nice. So when they have done something like a targeted behavior that you might want to see, maybe talking to their teddy about them and the things that they have done is also really nice, because I mean, let's be honest, we all love overhearing nice things said about us, but to kind of positively reinforce some of those behaviors. So like, for example, oh, they did really well today. I noticed they were really gentle and really kind around the baby. But even just those little things can make such a huge difference, and it can make them feel really good. One of the other things I was going to mention was, and I suppose this is a really difficult one, and I think again it depends on the age of the child, and I think probably when you're talking about the older sibling, the younger that they are, the less they understand about the arrival of the new baby, and the more egocentric they are about themselves, because naturally that's what happens in terms of their stages of development. And because of that, they might not show as much interest in the baby. And I think what I'm trying to say here is, as much as possible, just try to allow that relationship to grow organically. Don't feel like you need to put a lot of pressure on that relationship developing, because it will grow over time. And obviously, mentioning little things or talking about little things can really, really help. But yeah, allowing it to kind of like grow organically over time is really important. And just to add to, and I know you mentioned about how can we kind of support maybe potential sibling rivalry, tied into that is there's naturally going to be big emotions when a new baby comes into the family. But there's going to be big emotions for us. I mean, to name a few, thinking about guilt, also excitement, exhaustion, all sorts of kind of big emotions going through us, but also at the same time there's going to be probably quite big emotions for our older child as well, because they're going through a period of uncertainty and change. And I think the more we can acknowledge those emotions and the more that we can talk about them and say, do you know what, I can see that, you might be finding this a little bit tricky, and do you know what, that's okay. And even going as far as saying, do you know what, I'm finding it a little bit tricky too, because it's hard, isn't it? Having somebody new coming into our family and things changing. And yeah, I'm finding the adjustment quite hard too. So let's kind of like work together on this. Is there anything we can do to help to support you? But yeah, working through it and really acknowledging those feelings can be really helpful. And again, it makes them feel important and it really involves them in what's happening.
Something you just mentioned there really just triggered me from Psychology 101, which is basically the id, which is the child, and how they are basically the center of attention up until the age of about 6 or 7, when they realize they are not the center of the world. That's always the part I feel of, they always label like, oh, if you're the first child, you're a helper and you're this, and they put these characteristics on. And I always feel like it's because if you become an older sibling at a younger age, it can have this kind of, well, this is just my take on psychology from many years ago, but it's just always that reminder of mine that it's a case of, yeah, you're kind of having to learn earlier than single children, basically, as it would be.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It's a huge transition, isn't it? And quite a tricky one at times, especially when you have been the centre of your parents' universe and then suddenly you have to share your parents. And that's really difficult, especially because you're sharing your parents with something that is so heavily reliant on them as well. It's a huge transition.
So now we're going to talk about when the baby arrives. So we're going to do a little bit of a twist on this. So I've got a few questions and then we're going to kind of do the Dutch aspect of it. First off, we have kind of mentioned, I think, earlier about regression. So regression is quite common for the firstborns. So it's sleep or toilet training or behavior. How can parents respond in ways that support the first child rather than scold them because, you're tired and you're now having to care for two now?
Absolutely. I think it is really difficult, isn't it? Because when you're going through that huge change yourself, you are probably going to have less patience and you're going to feel absolutely exhausted. There's going to be times where you're not going to respond in ways that you would ideally want to, or with as much kindness and patience. And I think it's just demonstrating that level of understanding around that naturally there can be a little bit of regression for some children, especially around things like toileting, around baby talk. And really, it's likely just a bid for them to want to be closer to you. And it's them kind of demonstrating that actually I'm going through a bit of a tricky time right now, and probably quite subconsciously saying, I still really matter in this situation, despite this new baby coming in and changing everything. But I think something to always hold in the back of your mind, and I suppose this is the same with regressions and separation anxiety that we might see, is that actually it usually takes between 4 to 6 weeks for the child to get back on track. And I think it's just exercising patience around that and knowing that this is just a phase and it's not going to last forever. And once you've adjusted a little bit more to a consistent routine, they've adjusted a little bit more to a consistent routine, things will start to settle a little bit more, and things like regressions will start to kind of peter out, and separation anxiety will lessen.
So you did mention there separation anxiety. This is always a big thing for many. Are there any strategies that we can utilize to help them feel more secure?
I think a few of the things that we've mentioned before in terms of optimizing those moments of connection are really important, obviously providing lots of comfort. But I suppose when thinking about kind of periods of separation, maybe using things like transitional objects, or maybe using things like the Invisible String book is a beautiful book to kind of support connections and supporting children in understanding that we are always connected and we're always kind of thinking about them. So yeah, use of kind of like therapeutic type books like the Invisible String would be really lovely to, again, kind of maintain that connection. Also, I wondered about maybe talking a lot about them as a baby, maybe sharing stories of them as a baby, or sharing pictures of them as a baby, just to kind of remind them that you remember when they were a baby and when they were kind of very, very similar to their younger sibling now. Again, just I suppose it's just another way to connect, isn't it? And another way to kind of reflect on how far they've come and where they came from when they were tiny, but also where they are now. So yeah, just any moment of connection that you can possibly maximize, I think would be really helpful in terms of reducing that separation anxiety.
You mentioned there about identity. Are there any ways that parents can help the first child embrace their new identity as older sibling in a positive way?
I wonder if it's just talking about their new role as an older sibling, so as an older brother or as an older sister, and what are the positive things that they can do or bring to the situation. So I guess kind of going back to what I was saying before, in terms of what are the things that they could potentially teach them when they're older, or what are the things that they can really become involved in, what are the things that they can help with. And I suppose we still want them to have that identity as a child, but also at the same time, I suppose maybe scaffolding that a little bit in terms of supporting that positive identity around how they could help, and how they can be a really positive contribution to the family. But I also wondered about when children are going through something new, how play can be so incredibly important and influential in supporting them in working through that. So we know that often when children go through challenges, when children are given play as a tool to express themselves, they then kind of process what's going on for them through play. So could you perhaps provide opportunities where they can process what's going on for them in terms of that transition from being an only child to being an older sibling through play? So could it be around introducing them to things like dolls, or introducing them to certain things where they can kind of act out or express how they're feeling or express their current experiences? And could that maybe help to shape their identity to some extent?
So we did say we wanted to do a Dutch twist. So I've got a couple of questions here. First off, usually we see on social media, oh, you're having a second child. Don't forget, when you're in the hospital, keep the baby in the side bed. So when the sibling comes in, they'll see that baby in the bed and they don't see them attached to you already. Now we're in the Netherlands and some people like to give birth at home. So if you're giving birth at home, you don't have that little nestled little bed that the child can come into, but rather that child could be coming in and out as you're giving birth. What do you think is the best way to introduce your new child to their sibling in that home setting?
I think you've got to find a way that works best for you and your kind of family situation and dynamic. But I guess one that kind of springs to mind could be to ask someone who's maybe a non-family member, like for example, the Kramzorg, to hold the baby whilst you bring the child into the room. So you're available to kind of greet and talk to the child and then maybe provide some attention to that child first before then you introduce them to the baby. I know one thing that I've not actually mentioned and I meant to mention before, which I mean you could do this at any style of birth, but one thing that you could consider also is gifting the older child a gift from the baby, just again as that kind of like key transition to support that initial relationship, I guess. But it's definitely a strategy that I have come across a couple of times.
And finally, as we were saying, in the Netherlands, we're international families. We don't have our families immediately around us. And some might have just moved here and they're already about to give birth. What are we meant to do with their child? Like, is there a way that we can figure out already to prepare ourselves for that inevitable period when we don't know when we're going to give birth? How would you recommend parents to prepare themselves and the child?
I think this is a really, really tricky one. And it's something I have thought about if I'm ever in that situation. And I guess, yeah, it's really difficult. And again, I think it depends on family circumstances. But I know for me personally, if I was in that situation, it would be really, really tricky because both sets of our parents are a flight away and the baby could arrive within a 4-week period. So it's unrealistic to expect a family member to be here for that period of time to then be present for then potentially what might happen. So I suppose when I've kind of like considered that situation, I think one of the great things about the Netherlands is we have support like postpartum doulas where you are able to draw upon support from others and they're often available to then look after the older child whilst you might be giving birth or having some kind of like early moments and bonding time with your baby. I guess another advantage of being in the Netherlands is you also have the Kramzorg as well. Now, I apologise with my pronunciation of Kramzorg. It might not be spot on, so I apologise in advance. But I guess part of the Kramzorg support can also be around supporting the older sibling as well. So they obviously come and support you and the baby, but because you've already been through it before, they can also provide a bit more time to support the older sibling as well to kind of free you up a little bit. So that's an amazing advantage to being in the Netherlands that, yeah, other countries are not able to access.
You mentioned their postpartum doula. So we've previously had at least one on, obviously the famous Harriet, who's actually shared her postpartum period after a year of giving birth. How are they best, as a child psychologist, how are you seeing them to maximize the best for us, for our start as a new family of 4, but also the support of our firstborn?
I think it would be very personalised around kind of what you need. I personally haven't used one, but I have friends who have. And I know they said it was really, really helpful around kind of taking some of the load off and like initially during the birth side of things, especially if you have a hospital birth, that kind of brings in wider complications and you need someone who is able to be there. Yeah, so there's that element of it, but I think also in the following days, in the following weeks, when you maybe just need a little bit more support around childcare, whether that be supporting the baby to give you free time up to support the older sibling or the other way around, they can always be there to support. But also at the same time, I know, for example, Harriet, hope she doesn't mind mentioning this, but I follow her on Instagram, so I see a lot of what she's doing. But I suppose reducing some of your load as well especially around things like doing meal prep. So I know Harriet does a lot of meal prep for families, and just something as simple as that can make such a huge difference, because the cognitive load that is associated with, oh my goodness, what is for tea tonight? And then thinking, oh, we haven't got the food. I'm going to have to go to the shop. What do I need? And then to come back and then cook it and then serve it. And sometimes something as simple as meal prep support from a postpartum doula can be really incredibly helpful. And but also providing that emotional support as well, because it's not easy. Being a parent is not easy. And even if you've been through it once before, it doesn't mean that you know everything. And also there might have been quite a period of time in between having one baby and then the next. So yeah, having that kind of emotional support for you to kind of sound off can be really incredibly important.
Well, thank you so much, Faye, for joining us again and for talking about this huge topic, especially for our international families here in the Netherlands. You've highlighted a few very key topics, and we will be sharing on the Instagram on a carousel things like books and tips and suggestions from the child psychologist to help baby number one get ready for baby number two. Thank you, Faye.
Thank you for having me.